Welcome to Cicada Rising, where fear takes flight and the truth lies in the shadows. Prepare to be captivated by true accounts of the supernatural, eerie encounters, and unexplained mysteries. Brace yourself for a journey into the shadows, where every whisper and every creak could be a harbinger of something beyond comprehension. Now let's begin. My name's Mark. I have a hobby for exploring old abandoned buildings around the U.S. I find most of the places I visit by talking to people on some forums and subreddits, but lately the pickings have been kinda dry. I've started visiting old ones through internet archives and stuff. A lot of the times these places have been torn down or rebuilt at this point, but sometimes you can find some pretty cool places that haven't been torn down yet. I found this weird post by someone with the username Dastardly Dan from 2009 yesterday on an old urban exploration forum while messing around with the Wayback Machine earlier this week, though. People getting lost in these places isn't super uncommon, and generally others can come to their rescue or suggest resources to help. The police aren't always a great option, considering in a lot of cases you are trespassing on private property. With this one, though, there were no responses from others in the thread. Normally, there'd be at least one or two responses, or a follow-up from the original poster, saying they got out. I tried to find this place myself, and couldn't find anything that matched his description. I even tried following the directions on Google Maps and couldn't find it. I just can't get over it. Something about it messed with me. I figured you all would enjoy this, and maybe you can figure out where this place is. The thread itself is pretty long, taking place over the course of 3 days, so I'll be posting it in parts. I'd be interested to at least go see this factory. I don't think I'd go exploring there, though. First post in the thread, July 8th, 2009. Hey everyone, Dan here. My buddies and I kind of got ourselves in a pickle here. I'm gonna try and give as much detail as I can. The signal's kind of shit, so I can't upload any pictures. It's a miracle I'm even able to post this. There's 3 of us, and we're all from Florida. I'm typically the one who finds the places. Jackson records our adventures on his camcorder, and Paul is just along for the ride most of the time. We went to go visit one of those old houses outside Fayetteville, after someone on here suggested it, and I made a post here about our trip the other day. Someone in the comments suggested an abandoned factory they had seen in the area. They said they hadn't explored there yet and were waiting for the summer to be over, but gave us pretty clear directions on how to get there. They said to take US 401 on the way home and take a dirt road next to a pine tree alone in a field. They said there was no way we could miss it, and sure enough, we took US 401 back, and on one of those open stretches where there's nothing but woods and the road, on the right there was a single pine tree in a field with a dirt road beside it. Pull over. I think this is it, I said to Paul from the back seat. As he pressed on the brakes and steered off to the side of the road, he looked uneasy. His dark eyes stared down the road as he said, Dan, what if this is just someone's house or something? Why would a factory be down a road like this? Then we turn around and head home. No harm, no foul, I said nonchalantly. I tied my long blonde hair back and started psyching myself up. I was really hoping this wasn't going to be that, and that we hadn't been misled or something. Jackson, is the battery charged? Jackson rolled his eyes from the passenger seat. Yes, I charged it at the motel before coming here and haven't turned it on since we left. That's what you said before at the mansion, but then it died 20 minutes in. He turned around and shot me a look. That was a one-time thing. You're the one who told me not to waste the money on an extra battery. My point stands. He flipped me the bird and turned back to the front. We sat in silence as Paul drove down the dirt road cut through the trees. The road was long. We'd probably been going down it for half an hour when Paul finally said, Jesus, how long is this road? Maybe it's a nuclear power plant or something. That could be why it's so far away and in the middle of nowhere. Jackson turned to me. Wouldn't there be security or some kind of sign telling us to stay away or something? Even if it's abandoned. I shrugged. Maybe it's really old and they hadn't started doing that stuff yet. Jackson scoffed. I find that hard to believe. Jackson is a nice guy, all around. He's always thinks he's right, though. We've gotten into a ton of arguments over the dumbest shit, mostly because I just like to do it. Sometimes, though, his attitude gets on my nerves. It's like he's incapable of admitting his own mistakes. It's always someone else's fault with him. Finally, after another 20 minutes of driving, we saw a clearing up ahead. It looked like once the road entered the clearing, it taped off. I could see some tire tracks in the grass as we got closer. Once we entered the clearing, we could finally see the factory. There was one main building with 2 smokestacks on the left and a handful of buildings around it. Behind the main building, we could see a couple of short warehouses in the back. Paul drove up to the front of the main building and parked a few yards from the door. The windows were cracked and missing pieces of glass, and the bricks were overgrown with vines that sprouted from the dirt like massive hands dragging the building underground. Weirdly, there was no company branding or anything on the building. No sign out front or logo hinting at what was inside. I clapped and rubbed my hands together. You guys ready for this? Any uneasiness from before had faded from Paul's eyes, replaced with a bubbling excitement. As you guys know, the best part of exploring abandoned places like this is the moment right before you enter, when your mind is racing with possibilities of what you might find inside. Jackson had the camcorder out and was doing last-minute checks on the settings. I got all of our bags out and made sure we all had our walkie-talkies, flashlights, pocket knives, and first aid kits. You never knew where these places would lead or the environment you'd end up in. We exited the car and I turned to Jackson. He had his camcorder up and the red light was blinking. I waved to the camera and started practically skipping towards the door. Jackson stood back, filming the surroundings and capturing the field behind us. You could barely see the entrance to the dirt road from our angle. Paul walked behind me. We stood at the door, waiting for Jackson to join us. You coming? I called. One sec. Jackson's camera was focused on an upstairs window. I walked over. What is it? I thought I saw something in the window. I punched his shoulder. Dude, it's probably just some crackhead or squatter. You know they hang out at these places all the time. He glanced at me and returned his gaze to the window. He sighed. You're probably right. Let's go. Paul called out. Dan, Jack, the door's locked. I grinned. So, we get to make our own. This just keeps getting better and better. I scanned the ground and found a fairly sizable rock, about the size of a baseball. I picked it up, dusted it off, and aimed for a window. It went straight through with a loud shatter that echoed inside the factory. I walked up to the window and knocked away the remaining glass shards. Looking inside, the place looked mostly gutted. There were steel pillars supporting the ceiling, but aside from a few pieces of general industrial junk like pieces of concrete, there was nothing else inside. I could see a doorway on the far wall, but couldn't really make out anything beyond that. I could smell rust in the stale air. I turned to the camera. You guys ready? Jackson nodded and smiled from behind the camera as I swung my leg over the ledge and stepped inside. Once inside, the smell intensified. The air itself smelled rotten and dead more so than other places we had explored. I looked around the room. Just as I thought, it was totally empty. I shone a light at the doorway and could see shapes in the darkness. Jackson and Paul followed behind. Paul retched. What is that smell? No idea. I think I see the work floor up ahead through there, though, I said, pointing at the doorway. Let's go check it out, Jackson said, plowing forward with his camcorder in one hand and flashlight in the other. Our voices echoed in the large space, creating an eerie feedback loop that hung in the air. As Jackson approached the door, he paused, pointing the camera at a piece of concrete about the size of a basketball on the ground. What the hell is that? I walked up next to him and gasped. A bird lay underneath the concrete, smashed into a bloody smear of feathers and guts against the ground. One of its wings stuck out from beneath the rubble like an outstretched arm. This was fresh. I shined my flashlight into the dark doorway as Jackson remained frozen in place. Paul walked over and immediately gagged, turning away and grabbing onto a pillar as he held his stomach. Guess we found out what the smell was. Poor guy's probably only been dead a couple days, I said, scanning the doorway for any sign of movement. There were no other entrances or exits to the room outside of this doorway and the locked door from before. And of course, our makeshift broken window door. Paul walked over, clearly upset. Are you kidding? That thing looks like it's just been killed. That smell that's making you want to puke only starts after a day. Decomposition takes time, I retorted. What the hell could have done that? Not one of us could pick up that piece of concrete, Jackson said, finally breaking his gaze from the deceased animal. Let's find out. I rolled up my sleeves and walked over to the piece of concrete. I grimaced and tried my best to grab the sides of the rubble without touching the body, and got a decent grip on it. I tensed my muscles and tried to lift it to no avail. I stood back and dusted my hands off on my jeans. Probably just some junkie with crackhead strength. We should all be on our guard and keep it down, though, in case he's still around here. Fuck this, I don't want to screw around with some junkie, Paul yelled. He was shaking. We hadn't bumped into people before, but knew it was always a risk. Let's just go. I walked over to him and put my hand on his shoulder. Paul, there are 3 of us who all have knives. We're safe, okay? This is no different than all the other times we've been exploring. Remember the rat? About a year ago, we were checking out an old treehouse in our town that had supposedly been abandoned. We walked inside, and there were beer cans and cigarette butts all over the place. It was clear it had become some kind of hangout spot for the teens around. In a corner of the room, there was a piece of twine with a rat's body hanging from it. Paul had reacted similarly, freaking out thinking that some crazy person had done it, and I reminded him that it was probably just some kids doing a dumb prank. I didn't think this was some kind of prank, though. That was part of the reason I tried to lift the concrete. To be honest, I was kind of nervous about the whole thing myself. It didn't make sense, even to me, for even a bum or something to do this, much less have the actual strength to lift something like that, with enough force to be able to do the damage done to the bird. But I wanted to explore. I wanted to see more of this place, crackhead or not. So, I kept a calm demeanor and tried my best to calm Paul down. Besides, addicts aren't people to be afraid of. They're people just like you and I. Thankfully, it worked. He seemed to relax a bit with this thought. I turned back to Jackson, who still had his camcorder out. You all ready to see the work floor? Let's find out what kind of factory this was, I said, flashing a smile. My friends reluctantly followed me, and God, I wish they hadn't. We traveled through the doorway and entered the massive work floor. It was hard to tell with the darkness and cluttered surroundings, but I'd say the room was about the size of a basketball court. I shined my flashlight on the dark shapes I had seen before. They were textile machines. There were dozens of them, aligned in tight rows. It was darker in here than the first room. There was only one row of windows on the left side of the room. It looked like there was an office or something in the back left corner of the room, separated from the machines. The floor was covered in rotten cotton and paper. What happened here? Jackson said, walking over to one of the machines with a crank on the side. He gently pushed it, and it made a sickening creak that echoed throughout the room. Isn't that the question we always ask? I joked. Jackson chuckled. I guess that's true. We walked among the machines. They were worn down by time. Some of them, like the scutching machine, I had to look that one up, it's what they use to purify the cotton, still had material in them, though it was rotted beyond belief. Some of it was growing mold that created a smell of decay in the air. There were doors at seemingly random points on the wall, but each was locked or stuck and wouldn't budge. Did anyone else notice how much colder it is in here? Paul said, rubbing his arms. I looked down at mine and saw goosebumps. It was weirdly chilly here, especially for North Carolina in July. Maybe it's some kind of draft that blows through here or something. Our steps echoed softly in the room as we silently all looked around and took it in. I began to make my way to the office I had seen in the back of the room. "You guys ready to check out the office? Doesn't look like there's much more in this building," I asked. My friends nodded as they walked over to me. Jackson put his camcorder away, exchanging it for his pocket knife. The office had no windows, and the door was slightly ajar. With my friends behind me, I pulled out my knife and stood on the side of the hinges of the door. I pushed it open gently and waited a moment. I glanced back at my friends and stepped inside. It was pitch black in here. Without any windows, the only light came from the doorway. I shone my flashlight around the room. It was pretty simply furnished, with a wood desk and chair on the left side of the room, a bookshelf in the back left corner, and a filing cabinet on the right. The walls were beige and unadorned, aside from a clock beside the door. I walked over to the filing cabinet and pulled it open. It was full of manila folders full of paperwork packets and what I would assume to be company memos. I pulled one out and set it on the desk. I took off the rubber bands that were tying the documents together and opened it. It was some kind of employee handbook or something. The company listed on the front was Devorator Textiles. Weird-ass name, I muttered under my breath as I began flipping through the document. "Hey, check this out. I think there's something behind the bookshelf," Jackson said. I turned my head up to him. "Look." He pointed to a sliver of dark wood that peeked out from behind the bookshelf. It stood in stark contrast to the light beige of the walls. Paul walked over. "Let's move the bookshelf." I nodded in agreement and walked over. I stood on the edge closest to the wall, while Paul and Jackson pulled on it from the other side. The bookshelf creaked as it began to tip over. "Shit, shit, shit, shit," I yelled, running to the other side in a desperate attempt to keep it from falling. It tipped over on its face with a deafening crash. "So much for staying quiet," I sneered, looking down at the bookshelf. "Holy shit," Paul whispered softly. I turned my head up to see what the bookshelf had revealed. It was a door. "Dude, this is sick," Jackson exclaimed, grabbing his camcorder out of his bag. A deep feeling of dread began to set in. It was like a primal part of my brain knew something was wrong about that door. We should have turned back, but that adventurous spirit in me reared its head and spat in the face of my doubts. I had to go forward. I was an explorer. "Let's see where this goes," I announced, reaching tentatively for the handle. It was like every instinct I had was telling me to not touch that doorknob, but I did it anyways. I grasped it gently and slowly turned it. The door opened with a creak and revealed a staircase descending down. Jackson laughed. "Dude, this is nuts. We gotta post this to YouTube or something when we get out of here." He stepped into the doorway with his camcorder and flashlight in hand, descending the stairs rapidly. Paul followed behind him, and I brought up the rear. As I stepped in the doorway, something told me to make sure that door didn't close. I stepped back into the office and pushed the bookshelf slightly into the doorway, propping the door open. I then raced down the steps to catch up with my friends in the growing darkness. It's funny, when you're in a pitch-black room, you can't imagine that it could possibly be darker. As we descended the steps and got further and further away from the doorway, though, it did just that. It was as if the darkness was growing in intensity. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me or something, but I could have sworn that our flashlights were getting dimmer, and the air was getting colder, almost icy with every step we took. My mind wandered back to the bird corpse we had found maybe an hour prior to this. Maybe the killer was lurking down here in the shadows. After walking down these steps for a few moments, it was like the cold had reached a threshold of some kind. My teeth were chattering. "I can see the end up ahead." "Almost there," Jackson called out. I looked over his shoulder. I could see a small rectangle of light ahead of him. We pressed on and found ourselves in some kind of cellar. There were crates lining the walls. The light came from an oil lantern hanging from the ceiling. I switched off my flashlight and walked over to the lantern. "Shouldn't this be out?" I asked aloud. Jackson and Paul had begun inspecting the crates. In comparison to what we had seen above, these were all in good shape. They looked old and weathered, sure, but the structural integrity of the container was still intact. They were chattering to each other, attempting to figure out how to open one of them when Paul looked up at me. I don't know about you, but all that darkness was getting to me. There's light down here, and I'm not gonna argue about whether or not it should be. I'm just happy we can see our own hands without a flashlight. I looked around the room. There was another door. Loud thumps behind me snatched my attention. I turned around to see Paul repeatedly kicking a crate trying to open it, while Jackson filmed it. Hey, if you two knuckleheads are done screwing around, I'm pretty sure there's more to this basement. They stopped their assault of the crate to look at me, and then noticed the door. Oh shit, the mystery deepens, Jackson said, turning the camcorder to the door. Shall we continue on our journey? Paul came up beside him and nudged him. I think we have to. Paul stepped in front and opened the door. He stepped inside and we followed behind him. We found ourselves in a duplicate version of the office above, except this time there were two strange paintings on the wall behind the desk. I walked over to get a better look as Jackson began to inspect the bookshelf, and Paul walked over to the filing cabinet. The two paintings were in gold frames, displaying scenes that looked mundane until closer inspection. One showed a peaceful countryside with a bridge over a creek. Beside the bridge, there was an oak tree. It looked innocent enough until you noticed that the shadow of the oak tree depicted someone hanging. The other painting showed a scene from a party that looked like a scene straight out of The Great Gatsby. However, each guest's face was contorted with pain or fear rather than joy and merriment. The dancing looked more like panicked flailing. "What the fuck?" Jackson screamed from the other room. I ripped my gaze from the strange paintings and sprinted through the doorway, Paul following closely behind me. When I got to Jackson and looked around, my stomach dropped. This was not the same room we were just in. The entry hallway was gone. We were now back on the work floor, except everything was in perfect condition. The windows were no longer cracked, and the machines were neat and in order. I sprinted back into the office. It had changed too. The wallpaper was peeling, and the smell of mold filled the air. The file cabinet was thrown open, and the papers were scattered everywhere. "What the fuck happened?" I muttered. Jackson and Paul began to enter the office. Suddenly something clicked into place. I screamed, "Stop!" and walked over to them out of the office. I shut the door behind me and opened it. Sure enough, it was now more decrepit, except the files were all back in the cabinet. Each time we change rooms, it's taking us deeper. We shouldn't have left the first room. We need to stay here, I explained, closing the door again. I pulled out my cell phone. I still had a signal, thank God. I opened up the forum page and logged in. I'm gonna make a SOS post on the forum. We need to wait for someone else to come get us. Who the fuck made you the leader? You're the reason we're stuck down here in the first place. Paul suddenly screamed, lunging towards me. Jackson caught him. Hey, chill the hell out. We don't know what the fuck is going on, but it's not gonna help if we're fighting. He fucking got us in some trippy-ass Twin Peaks type shit. Fuck this. Why should we stay here? We can walk outside, he exclaimed, at the end pointing at one of the shipment gates that was cracked open. I paused. We don't know what's out there. Jackson released Paul, and he seemed to shake off the rage. He still glared at me and stared at Jackson as he stepped in front of me. Now, hold on. That isn't a bad idea. It looks like it just goes outside. I looked at him like he was stupid. Okay, let's be real for a second. We went who knows how many stories underground. We found one room, entered another one from that, and the first room is now gone, replaced with a duplicate copy of a room upstairs. How the hell could we possibly have gotten to ground level? Jackson shrugged. It makes sense to me. No, it doesn't, I spat. Do whatever you guys want. I'm gonna get writing this post while I still have a battery. I turned away and focused on my phone. I heard them pause and mutter something to each other for a moment, and their footsteps slowly grew softer on the concrete floor. I heard a metallic groan as they opened the door. I scoffed. A couple minutes later, I heard screaming. I was almost done with the post. I bolted outside to find Paul on the ground, some 20 feet away from Jackson. who was close to the door. Paul was convulsing on the ground, in agony. He was the one screaming. I began to step forward, and Jackson shot his arm out, unable to tear his eyes from Paul as he writhed in agony. "Someone please, someone help me." I pushed Jackson's arm down. "What the fuck? Why aren't you helping him?" Jackson pointed to a small line of dirt around 4 feet from Paul. "It started when he crossed that line." "What do you mean?" "He stepped over that line, made it about 3 steps and collapsed." Blood was now coming out of Paul's eyes and ears as he shook. He was no longer screaming. Suddenly he stopped. He coughed and a splurt of blood shot out of his mouth and turned to froth on his lips. And then his chest stopped moving. Paul's fucking dead. Hey guys, it's Mark again. As you all know, I'm a big fan of urban exploration. I found this weird SOS post from 2009 by someone with the username Dastardly Dan on an old urban exploration forum. There were no responses. I just get a weird feeling reading this and had to share it with you all. Here's the second post. A quick note, by the way. I think I found the factory, or at least found better directions elsewhere on the forum. I'm gonna try and explore it soon and get some photos. I'm not going in that basement though. Second post in the thread, July 8th, 2009. Hey everyone. So I started writing that post before Paul. I really need some help out here. We couldn't even grab his body. We didn't want the same thing to happen to us. He's still out there, just laying there. I've went out to check on him a couple times. It's weird. It looked like he's almost dissolving into the ground itself, but there's no bugs or anything. No smell either, except for burnt hair for some reason. Jackson and I went back inside afterwards and decided to take turns exploring the office. One of us stayed on the work floor at all times, so it didn't change. But the office morphed every time one of us went in. The wallpaper would change, the layout would shift slightly. There'd be new paintings, and most importantly, documents. We figured if there was a way out, it'd be in one of those documents in the office. I went in first. Jackson said he wanted to review the footage. The office was back in order, but the wallpaper was still peeling. The eerie paintings from before were still on the wall, but with more details. The one with the shadow of the hanged man no longer just showed a shadow. You could see a crowd of 4 or 5 people walking away from the tree. The tree itself still didn't depict anything, but I could have sworn that the shadow of the man was swinging. The party now depicted blood coming out of the eyes and mouth. As I stared at their faces, I remembered Paul. The condition of the party-goers and his body were pretty similar. Maybe that painting was supposed to be a warning somehow. I tore my eyes from the paintings. The files were back in the cabinet, so I began walking over there. The rubber on my shoes stuck slightly to the rotting carpeting inside. I regret not bringing a paint respirator or something. I opened the cabinet slowly, the creak reverberating shallowly against the walls of the office. I pulled out a random folder and set it on the desk, the only surface in the room free from rot and dust. I'm not going to reproduce everything in these files. We were biding our time until we were hopefully rescued. Once that post was made, there really was nothing for us to do, so we just started reading the files. It was a way to pass the time. But I don't want to bore you with all the details, so I'm going to provide a summary of each packet in the order we checked them out, and how the room changed each time with us taking turns poring over the different files available. We counted 6 packets total. Each one was pretty large, but full of tedious graphs and charts most of the time, with a couple exceptions. One of the first things we noticed is only 1 packet would be available at a time. The other papers would be blank. So we started remembering which packets we pulled out after I drew a second one. Thankfully, I hadn't put the first one back. As for the first one, it was a Devorator Textiles end-of-year report. I took notes on my phone as I read. I couldn't make out the date. It looked like it had been smudged out. The names were also smudged out. It was like someone was purposely omitting certain information. It said they made clothing here, surprising no one. It was mostly monetary reports. I noticed some of the numbers didn't quite seem to add up. and there were clear pay gaps between workers. The manager of the factory itself seemed to be paid $36,000, while the workers were paid around $700 annually. I don't know much about this kind of thing, but that seemed like one hell of a pay gap. At the very end of the packet, there was a page that detailed a financial transaction directly to the city of Fayetteville itself. This wasn't mentioned anywhere else in it. I left the room and Jackson went in. I started typing this while I waited. He came out around 20 minutes later. Time didn't really seem to pass outside. I was standing in the sun outside checking on Paul's body. He was about halfway submerged in the ground at this point. Jackson summarized his findings. He found an incident log regarding a death in the factory and another worker's reaction to it. The names were smudged out, of course. It seemed the two employees worked alongside one another in the factory and lived nearby. They were married. One day, the man's arm got snatched into a machine. He bled out right in front of his wife. It was quick, according to the report, and was a result of a faulty machine alignment, whatever that means. She quit her job but began writing the factory and petitioning to close it down. There were detailed accounts of her efforts, as she literally stood in the middle of town and shouted about how much she hated the factory and its management. Progressively, her speeches became more and more hostile, and then one day, she mailed a dead bird to the factory. It had been crushed. A chill went down my spine when he told me that as I remembered the bird we had seen when we first all walked in. I felt my heart skip a beat as Paul's face flashed in my mind, but I quickly pushed it away and turned my attention back to Jackson, taking notes as he spoke. At that point, Devorator Textiles pursued legal action, of course. She stopped writing directly to the factory, but continued to preach hostility against the company, calling for employees to turn against the employers in favor of better work conditions. This, too, was met with legal action, and she spent a few nights in jail. After that, things were quiet for 9 months, according to the documents. No one heard from her for a while, and then one day she turned up on the front porch, dead, and in her pocket was a note. It read, "The greedy pig will feed and feed long after its mind fails. A rabid beast through and through, in its stomach stories it will tell." This was the end of the file. I assume the company went on for 10 years afterwards, as updates were made throughout further detailing the event after the fact, with updates on years since the incident, without mentioning a date for whatever reason. This was some kind of stain on their legacy that had consequences in some way in the years that followed. Unsurprisingly, I went in next. Jackson started reviewing the footage again as I walked back in. I had a feeling he kept watching Paul's death, trying to understand. I needed to distract myself. I was starting to hear things around the factory that'd make me jump. It could have just been the building resettling, but sometimes I heard shouting outside, or something that at least sounded a lot like it. I went into the office and shut the door behind me. Some of the partygoers in the painting had fallen, and you could now clearly see the silhouette of the hanged man on the branch of the tree. I walked silently over to the filing cabinet and pulled out a new document. It was a collection of annual safety inspection reports. The dates were, again, smudged out, and most personal names were as well. It seemed like once or twice a year they'd receive a safety inspection from a city office. They should not have passed this inspections. Every single report listed repairs and renovations the factory needed, but ended with them passing. Multiple times the same thing would carry over for multiple reports, and they just kept getting longer. By the end, they were discussing a black mold problem. I looked through and tried to find a mention of the death of the worker man and his wife, but there was nothing. Just so many notes about machines needing to be repaired, floors redone from cracking due to uneven weight distribution, water damage and mold were rampant. This place wasn't just dangerous to work at, it was gross. And to be fair, factory jobs have always been dangerous. Even today, power plant workers risk their lives every day and work insanely long hours. But they get paid well. I was pretty sure most power plants wouldn't have half of these comments, though. Some of them were outright ridiculous. One read that a particular machine would regularly rip and stretch the fabric, and multiple workers lost fingers to it trying to save the textiles. After poring over the records, I walked back out and Jackson took my place. We shut the door behind us each time we entered the office to reduce the chance of one of us walking in and fucking things up. I sat on the ground silently writing, and a few minutes later, he came back out. "That was fast," I said slowly. It was an internal memo just talking about a bunch of complaints against the boss. He was known for being a jokester, and not in a good way. Seemed like he was a real asshole, and it took way too long to fire his ass. A bunch of people quit due to his jokes, like lighting the linens on fire or hitting the workers. "I'm not really sure where the punchline is in that," Jackson responded, obviously trying to add some humor to our situation. I couldn't really see the joke at the moment. "Oh, yeah, there's 2 more folders in there. Guess it's time for me to go in," I sighed. I walked back into the office. The paintings were gone, and in their place there were just discolored marks on the wall, where they once were. I opened the filing cabinet and pulled out a new folder. It was blueprints of the factory and some of the machines. I took notes on it and walked inside. Nothing really that exciting, at least to me. I walked out of the office and told Jackson about it. "Lame," he muttered. "I'm gonna look at that final packet. We'll figure it out from there." He walked inside the office, and then he called for me a moment later. "Dan, get in here." He sounded panicked. I rushed into the office. He was throwing papers around in a panic. "The last one is just copies of this math formula," he said, getting to the end of the packet and breathing heavily. He stared at the last page. "It's just the same math problem, again and again." I walked over and looked down at the desk. The paper read, 1900 plus the sum of variables x1, x2, x3, x4, x5, and x6 minus variable x7 is equal to A. "It's a date," I said quietly. It was handwritten on each page. There was nothing else on it. I counted the number of pages. "There's 31 pages in this document." He looked up at me. "Do you think, even though the other ones are blank, the number of pages are the same?" I shrugged. "I mean, they don't change in appearance or size from what I've noticed. The pages are just blank." He collected each page and started pulling out the packets, counting each page. Then a horrible thought entered my mind. "I left the work floor," I said, the realization dawning on me. Jackson looked at me in horror. "Paul." I started walking to the door, and my hand froze on the handle. It was ice cold. I got a weird feeling from the door, the same one I had initially coming down here, like I shouldn't open it. We were officially deeper into the factory. There was no telling what would await us on the other side. It could just be worn and broken, or the thing that killed the bird from before. Jackson stood behind me with the packets in hand. "You took good notes, right?" "Yeah," I said silently, staring at the door as an internal war waged in my mind. "Need me to open it?" I let go of the handle. I was shaking. "Yeah, I think so." Jackson reached in front of me awkwardly and grabbed the door handle, flinching at the chill of the metal. He creaked it open. It slowly opened, and as it did, we could hear industrial noises from inside. I braced myself for what we were about to see, and I was still shocked. There were people on the work floor, operating the machines and making clothes. They all looked kind of desaturated though, like they were slightly faded. It made them stick out. We stood there in the doorway, just floored for the moment by what we saw. Then, without saying a word, we stepped out onto the work floor. I walked over to someone. "Hey, do you think you can help me out?" They didn't respond. "Hello?" No reaction. I turned back to Jackson. He shrugged and tried talking to someone himself. No one paid attention to us. Even if they bumped into us directly, it was like we were invisible. And they bumped into us a lot. They couldn't see us, obviously. They'd just instantly recover and continue with their business. We went back to the office door. Jackson slumped to the floor against the wall. "What the hell?" "I'm gonna go back in the office," I told him definitively. "I'll stay here. Jackson said, burying his head in his arms. I opened the office door. There was a man in a suit behind the desk, poring over paperwork. A deep feeling of uneasiness set in. And then the man looked up, lost in thought. He was staring right at me, but it was like he was looking through me. My eyes grew wide. My skin crawled as I croaked out a name. Paul? Ready for more? Curious what happens next? Join us for the next chapter. Hit subscribe now to unlock the full story. As we conclude this bone-chilling installment of Cicada Rising, we urge you to join our community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. To submit your own stories, contact us at mhpicadon@gmail.com, including Cicada Rising in the subject line. Until our paths cross again, remember, the darkness is only as frightening as the secrets it conceals. Stay vigilant, stay connected, and keep the fear alive with Cicada Rising.